is Normal People, an Autistic Analysis into Neurodiverse Communication and Innovation through Diversity. So it's quite a long title, and I'll hit on all the topics that are included in that throughout the presentation. Firstly, a little bit about me. I qualified as a teacher before starting my PhD. I've written a book, and my next one's coming out in May, which is a guide for autistic people starting university. And I am autistic myself, hence the autistic analysis part of the title of my thesis. And the logo on the right-hand side is from the project that I'm currently working on with Swansea University, which is Autism from Menstruation to Menopause. We're looking at the reproductive health experiences of autistic people with wombs. We're at an exciting part at the moment. We've just started interviewing, so that is what's going on at the moment. So the first thing that I sort of came up against was the actual definition of neurodiversity itself, because it is simultaneously a model, a paradigm, and a movement. It's a model, much like the deficit model and the social model. It's a paradigm through which we work. Every part of our research can be influenced by this paradigm. And finally, it's a movement, like any other social justice movement. So when we refer to neurodiversity and neurodiversity affirming, we've got all these other definitions that we need to contend with and keep up to date with. So I developed some research concerns. So these came before the research questions. And I wanted to look at how autism had developed since the very first use of the term, over 100 years ago now, to the different models that are used to describe it and how the history of autism has influenced these. And then I wanted to look at how autistic communication is conceptualized within these models, whether it is deficit focused or more social model and neurodiversity focused. And finally, I wanted to look at neurotype specific interaction and communication, in that autistic people communicating with other autistic people compared to non-autistic people communicating with non-autistic people, and then a mix of the two. So I had quite extensive background chapters, and this was because I spent a lot of my PhD stuck in one room during COVID. I started my PhD in the autumn of 2019, with my pilot due to start on March 20th, 2020. So that was somewhat affected. So my background chapters were quite extensive. And my first one was on autism itself. Second one was the models of disability. And I did this as a sort of chronological perspective from the deficit, medical, social, neurodiverse, but obviously some intersect and interact, and the deficit model is still very much with us, so it wasn't so much a chronology. Then I looked at the two sides of the dice, so how the world interacts with neurodivergence and how neurodivergent people interact with the world. And finally, I looked at information transmission and autistic communication. So I looked at ways that information is transmitted between individuals, not necessarily autistic people, and then specifically autistic communication. So my research background chapter to do with autism, I really enjoyed writing this. It was really interesting. A lot of you may know this already, but I found it really useful to start from the beginning, from the very first use of the term. And it was used in 1911. Really interesting person in 1926 was Suha Riva, who was a Soviet psychologist. And she actually described autism, as you can see, before Asperger or Kanner, who, you know, are both household names within autism, but Suha Riva is not. And there's been several explanations for why this could be. Some people said it's because, you know, it was written in the Soviet Union. However, her work was translated within a year into German, which obviously Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger both spoke. So I think it's more likely that it was because she was a woman, although that is speculation. We then obviously had Asperger in 1938 and Kanner in 1943, who both claimed to have discovered autism separately. However, two assistants of Asperger, so Annie Weiss and George Frankel, moved to America to escape the Nazis in the early 1940s. And they actually worked for Asperger and then went on to work for Kanner. So depending on how much they actually shared of their research with Kanner, it could be very likely that he also learned from Asperger. So we've got the three main, in my view, the three main founders of autism. Sue Hariva especially is very interesting because her definitions for autism were incredibly similar to the DSM-4's definition, despite the fact that it was almost 70 years previously. Autism itself didn't actually come into the DSM until a lot later. Autistic thinking was described, and then there was pervasive development disorder. And of course, Asperger syndrome only existed for 19 years. And the removal of it in 2013. The next one I looked at was the deficit, the social and the neurodiversity models, and the ways that these evolved into each other and out of each other. And the social model of disability very much as a disability rights movement, the nothing about us without us, evolving into the neurodiversity specifically from that. I'll do a slight trigger warning for the next slide. There'll be mention of filicide and of sexual assault when I'm talking about the statistics for the next slide. So you can probably come back in 5 minutes if so. So in the interactions, so I was looking at the way that the world interacts with neurodivergence, and I did an analysis of the media that was used to describe autism, and the main thing I found from a lot of the papers that described autism was the inaccuracy in terms of autism itself, and also the misogyny inherent, which I've touched upon already with Sue Hariva. But there was a very interesting study by Clark in 2012 who found that women's magazines were more likely to have first-hand accounts from people describing how difficult it was to have autistic children, whereas the general audience and men's magazines were more likely to have statistics and scientific facts, although these often weren't actually facts themselves. And what was hypothesized was that this was encouraging the role of the mother as one that is highly sort of sacrificial, gives up everything, knows better than doctors, and putting a lot of expectations onto women. Yeah, that was what was found in a lot of the papers that looked at the media and the way that autism is represented. In terms of health, 39, that is the average life expectancy of autistic people. And obviously the mental health problems that autistic people face compared to the general population. In terms of crime, we've got 9 in 10, that is the number of autistic women that experience sexual assault, and 56%, which is the number of filicides that involved an autistic child. So it paints a very negative picture of the way that the world interacts with neurodivergence. And then I thought, well, how does neurodivergence interact with the world? And I thought, well, how do we actually look at this? How do we measure? Because we've got lots of ways of measuring how the world interacts with neurodivergence, but not so much how neurodivergent people interact with the world. And this is where ideas of rapport come into it and how we measure rapport. found that silence is a very good measure of rapport and how autistic people are thinking and feeling in a situation. Masking, how autistic people mask within their own communities, but also to not autistic people. Helping others, so whether autistic people help or are helped, and the intersectionality between various other identities. So measuring rapport is quite difficult to do because you really have to ask the people themselves. There's been a couple of papers where we've looked at this, which I'll make links to when I describe my research methods. I'm clicking, why isn't it going to the next slide? There we go. So next, within the neurodiversity paradigm, I thought, well, what ways do we have of measuring rapport and the ways of measuring interactions between people? And the model that obviously we have all been taught is the theory of mind model. The idea that, you being able to mind read what someone else is saying is an integral part of being human. However, if there is a theory of mind, then I hypothesize there is an autistic theory of mind, or ATOM, as it abbreviates quite nicely. However, if we've got both of them, then actually the best way to describe it is the double empathy problem. So the idea that it's the lack of reciprocity due to a mismatch of neurotypes that causes any sort of relationship difficulty between two different social actors with different neurotypes. But then, how do we measure the double empathy problem? How do we put this to use within empirical research? So using the literature, using the models, and using all of that, I developed some research questions and hypotheses. They're quite long-winded, so I won't go through all of them and I'll just move on to sort of them one at a time. But what I wanted to look at was task performance, reciprocal interaction, and familial resemblance of physical outputs. The method that we used for this was the diffusion chain method. I really like the diffusion chain method because it shows cumulative effects rather than just paired interactions. So you can sort of see familial changes across a sort of a lineage. So it's like the game Telephone or Chinese Whispers, as lots of people in the UK would know it as. And this is just an illustration from Catherine Crompton by Sonny, and it shows information being passed down a line of participants. And this is actually from the same research day as the data that I'm going to present. If you like the less moving version of the graphic, this is as images. And we have 3 conditions. I don't know if you can see my cursor. We have 3 conditions, and we have one all autistic, one all not autistic, and then one where it's alternating. The first person completes the task while the second person watches. The second person then completes the task while the third person watches, and so on, until you've got the last person who completes it unobserved. The task in this case was to build a spaghetti tower. This is one of the images from the study. They were asked to build a spaghetti tower while the next person watched. They had spaghetti, they had plasticine, and the first person was given some images of potential spaghetti towers that they could build. And the task was just build a tower as tall as you can. So, as I said with my research questions, I was looking at task performance or success, interactions, specifically silences, and I wanted to look at the familial resemblance, so the similarities. In terms of success, there wasn't actually any difference in the tower height across the conditions. So all of the chains produced towers of roughly the same height anyway. What was interesting was the number of towers that were exactly the same height. I thought this might be an error to begin with. Turned out it was just when you put two bits of spaghetti on top of each other, it makes 50 centimetres. So there were lots of the same. There were some that were less than 25 centimetres, which in my mind is quite hard to do, given that one piece of spaghetti is 25 centimetres and they had 5 minutes. But anyway, there was no difference in success depending on the condition. So I measured the silence, so that was between the person building it and the person observing them, and this was significant. As you can see by the bar graph, there was the most silence in the neurodiverse condition. So that's where you had an autistic person and a not autistic person interacting, and the least silence in the not autistic condition. The neurodiverse condition was really awkward to code because there was one interaction that was entirely silent. From the moment the researcher left to the moment she came back in, not a word was spoken. And so, yeah, the silences were much longer and much more frequent within the neurodiverse condition. In terms of similarities, this is where I collected data online. I did it via Prolific, but I also put a call out on Twitter to try and get more autistic participants because I wanted to see if there was a difference between how autistic and not autistic people rated similarity. I found interesting, just out of curiosity, the gender difference between the two samples. As you can see, much more women in the autistic group compared to the not autistic group as a proportion, and many more people not identifying as male or female. So what they're asked to do is match towers. On the left is just the example that they were asked to do, so they understood the task, and on the right was the much less interesting matching of the towers. They're in black and white because we realised after the research day that each research day had a different colour of plasticine used, so it would have been very easy to tell which chain they were from, so they had to go into black and white, which is a limitation of the study, which I acknowledge and would definitely change if I was to do this again. This is a big load of text, but I'll just explain, which there were differences in the similarity between the towers, in that they were more likely to be similar in the neurosimilar chains. So if it was an autistic person watching another autistic person, they were more likely to build a chain like the one they had watched. Whereas if a non-autistic person was watching an autistic person, they would be less likely to build a tower that looked the same. This is the paper that we wrote about it. And as you can see, the autistic status of the rater didn't make any difference. I didn't really think it would. However, there's some evidence out there that autistic people integrate sort of shape recognition differently. And obviously part of the diagnostic criteria for autism is I focus on small parts rather than the whole. So I thought there might be some difference between the autistic and non-autistic raters, but there wasn't, which is kind of what I expected. So basically, people innovated more in the neurodiverse condition, people copied more in the neurosimilar conditions, but then why is the question. But it could be to do with rapport. So if you have more rapport with someone, you might be more likely to copy, and therefore less likely to copy someone who is different. This is similar to the diversity breeding innovation. Sorry, go back a sec. So the idea that they didn't copy, I thought, well, let's turn this on its head. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So they might have had less rapport, but the different outcomes that they produced were more diverse. And therefore, this is similar to the diversity breeding innovation hypothesis, which shows that the more diverse your business, the better your business does. So for neurodiversity and the neurodiverse condition actually produced innovation within this. So the sort of overarching conclusion for this is autistic people cause things to be different, but is that a bad thing? So the towers were no bigger or smaller within each condition, but they were more different within the neurodiverse condition, and that's something to think about.